Supreme Court cases are our favorite. Supreme Court cases are our favorite. Just kidding. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but they are mine. I love doing some Supreme Court cases. So let's go ahead and jump in with Congress case. Kind of a technical one. I'm not sure if this is everybody's favorite case, but it's at least it's definitely interesting. We actually have one term jurisdiction that we have to do that's part of this case, so you understand that. So 2.35 jurisdiction. You've probably already written it. And you also need a yellow sheet of paper that has a Supreme Court case or one that's been printed out on white sheet of paper at maybe home. Okay, here we go. Jurisdiction backside. All right, it's the power of a court to make a decision on a particular case. The power of a court to make a decision on a particular case. So, for example, what do we mean by jurisdiction? Well, if you were going to divorce someone, you don't go to the Supreme Court. If you're going to divorce someone, you go to a family court. The family court has jurisdiction. If you're going to sue someone because they scratched your car with their key, you're going to a small claims court. You're not going to the federal district court. All right, so like certain courts have certain jurisdiction over certain cases. Supreme Court deals with violations of rights or with things dealing with federal law. But your local court that deals with teenagers who are breaking the law, that's a whole different. That's a juvenile court. So see, like juvenile court deals with juvenile law breaking, and so that is their jurisdiction. Supreme Court deals with a different types of jurisdiction. So jurisdiction is just their ability to rule on a particular case. Okay, here we go. You got your Supreme Court case. Looks like this. Remember, you don't have to do the pair reading up top. We'll probably do that in class if we did it. And then remember when you're studying these, the key things you have to do to be able to write about them, because you're going to have to do a Supreme Court essay. And in order to write them, you're going to have to know the key clause. That's going to be huge, or amendment. The facts of the case. Make sure you know the facts. And then the ruling and decision. Those are the three things that are most important. So when we're done, take your whiteboard and try to write those three things out. That is so key for Supreme Court. Or tell your mother, or tell a sibling, or tell someone in your family. Explain it to them without looking. All right, Unit 2. Case is Baker v. Carr. Remember, the person suing is named first, so Baker's doing the suing. 1961. And the issue is redistricting, which we just talked about. Remember, to redistrict means to redraw legislative seat boundaries. So that would include federal House seats and then all state seats, state Senate seats, and state lower House seats. So in Virginia would be the House of Delegates. All right, cool. Let's go to the next thing then. Clause and amendment. It is the Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment. Equal Protection Clause, 14th Amendment. You're going to see this come up a lot. Remember, this is the amendment, the 14th Amendment, which protected the rights of newly freed slaves after the Civil War, and it also restricted power of the states. This amendment should have protected newly freed slaves from things like the Jim Crow laws, but because later presidents and Democratic Congresses and also Democratic appointees Supreme Court basically ignored it. It took until the 1960s Civil Rights Act, which we'll talk about when we get to civil rights, to really bring this 14th Amendment into full fruition. Unfortunately, it took 100 years almost. All right, facts of the case, Baker v. Carr. Tennessee has a 1901 law that mandated redistricting of legislative seats based on population changes. So as people were moving from rural areas in the early 1900s to urban areas, of course, by 1960, that had been a big amount of movement. They were supposed to redraw the legislative seats to be more equal, but they weren't. And 60 years meant there were some pretty wacky districts in Tennessee, like a rural area, a rural county has 30,000 people with one representative. And then like some city, like Nashville or an area around Nashville might have 150,000 and they get one representative. So you see how like there's 150,000 people represented by one person, and then there's 30,000 people represented by one person. It's not fair. One has 5 times more voting power than the other. So this law that mandated redistricting was ignored. The effect was that 1/3 of the population of Tennessee was electing 2/3 of the seats in the state house. And that was mostly the rural areas. The rural areas were 1/3 of the population, and they're electing 2/3 of the seats in the state house. So this is just not really, representation is not equal. The people in the cities, their needs might be being ignored as a result of this. So 1961, Baker, a citizen, sues and says it's a violation of the law to ignore population changes. It's a violation of law to ignore population changes. And ultimately, his argument will rest on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which restricted state power and said that it's a violation of equal protection for a rural area with a small population had the same voting power as a urban population area. All right, so how did it turn out? Well, there was a question that they had to actually answer first before they could even rule on it, and that question had to do with jurisdiction. Did the Supreme Court have jurisdiction over questions of legislative redistricting? Now, you should know there was an earlier case from the 1940s where the Supreme Court said no, and they said we're not going to get involved in the political thicket. And what they meant by political thicket is that getting involved in this whole redistricting at a state level is just the Supreme Court getting involved in things it shouldn't get involved in. That redistricting was a political question. Political questions should be dealt with by legislatures. So therefore, they weren't going to get involved in the political thicket. But this Supreme Court is going to rule differently. All right, the vote was 6-2 for Baker. He wins. Baker wins. All right, and Baker. By the way, Carr was a person who worked for the government of Tennessee and was over elections and whatnot, so he's the one who gets sued. All right, yes, SCOTUS, or Supreme Court of the United States. I can't remember if I've told you that yet. Probably I have. But SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States. By the way, POTUS is President of the United States. But SCOTUS can force states to correct redistricting imbalances. So they might have said earlier in a previous Supreme Court case 20 years earlier that they couldn't, but now they're saying they can. And by the way, the only people that can overrule the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court, except for Congress if they pass an amendment. But the reality is that most Supreme Court rulings are overruled by a future Supreme Court potentially, if they're overruled at all. All right, and this is going to be important, and here's why. Because there's going to be some decisions in the years right after Baker v. Carr that are that lead to what are called the one man, one vote decision in future cases. And the idea here is that it should be pretty equal, that one person in one district should have equal voting power of a person in another district. And so that meant that states must redistrict after each census. They can't just ignore it like Tennessee was doing. They must actually go ahead and redistrict their seats to make sure that it is equal, because otherwise it's a violation of equal protection. Okay, the dissent, the people who disagreed. So remember, it was 6-2 decision, so 2 Supreme Court justices disagreed, and here's what they said. They said, well, one, this is a political question, it's not a legal question. This is a legislative question, it is not a question that the Supreme Court should be dealing with. This is political. They said this is a judicial power grab, that the judiciary is taking over powers from the legislature, and that this is just making the Supreme Court way more powerful than it really should be in our system of checks and balances. And as a matter of fact, they said it is a violation of separation of powers to have the Supreme Court involved in redistricting questions. You know, one argument too that was used against this decision was the fact that there exists the Senate, and the Senate, every state has 2 votes regardless of population. And so therefore the principle of one man, one vote doesn't even apply in the Senate. I mean, California has 40 million people and it has 2 senators. And then South Dakota, which has less than 1 million people, has 2 senators. So like, that's not fair. That's not one man, one vote. I mean, you'd have to rule that the whole Constitution was unconstitutional for this to be true. So there are some legal issues and just logical issues with this case. But in the end, the Supreme Court ruled 6-2, and this case moves forward. All right, awesome. Thanks. Make sure you study it.